The loneliest platform in Wyoming. The wind cut through Laramie Station like a knife through burlap, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and something else, something lonely that settled deep in a man's bones. Jacob Mercer stood on that platform with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, watching his breath turn to fog in the December cold. Around him, families pressed together in warm clusters, children squealing as they spotted relatives stepping down from the Union Pacific cars, wives throwing their arms around husbands who'd been gone to the railhead camps or the silver mines up north. But Jacob stood alone, separated from all that joy by an invisible wall that might as well have been built of stone and mortar. That he'd been standing there for near about 40 minutes, watching 3 trains come and go, scanning every face that appeared in those doorways, hoping against hope to see someone, anyone who might be looking for him. His sister had promised in her last letter, the one that arrived in October, that she'd try to make the journey from Kansas City for Christmas. But October had given way to November, November to December, and now here it was Christmas Eve, and Jacob was beginning to accept what his heart had known all along. She wasn't coming. Nobody was coming. He would spend another Christmas alone in the room he rented above the saddle shop, listening to other people's laughter filtering up through the floorboards while he ate whatever cold supper he could manage and pretended it didn't matter. That the thing about loneliness is that it doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It creeps up slow, like frost on a window pane, until one day you wake up and realize you can't remember the last time someone said your name with affection. Jacob had lost his parents to cholera when he was 19, lost his young wife Sarah to childbed fever just 2 years into their marriage, lost the baby boy who never drew a single breath. That was 7 years ago now, and in those 7 years, Jacob had become a ghost in his own life, going through the motions of living without ever really feeling alive. He worked at the lumber mill, he paid his rent, he nodded to people on the street, but he hadn't let anyone close enough to matter, hadn't risked his heart on anything that could hurt him again. That the station master was beginning to close up the ticket office when Jacob heard it, the distant whistle of one more train coming in from the east. He told himself he was a fool for staying, that hope was a dangerous thing for a man like him to carry, but his feet wouldn't move. Maybe it was the season, maybe it was the memory of Sarah and how she used to love Christmas, used to fill their little cabin with pine boughs and candles and laughter, but something kept him rooted to that platform while the last train of the evening hissed and groaned to a stop. That the first passengers off were the usual sort, drummers with their sample cases, a preacher with his black coat and Bible, a family with too many children and not enough patience. Jacob watched them all with dead eyes, already turning to leave when he saw her. She stepped down from the third car, moving careful like someone who wasn't sure of her welcome, and she was the most out-of-place creature he'd ever seen on a Wyoming railway platform. She wore a coat that had maybe been fine once but was now threadbare at the cuffs, and she carried a carpet bag that looked like it held everything she owned in this world. But it wasn't her shabby clothes that caught his attention. It was her face. That she had the kind of face that made a man think of Madonnas in old paintings, pale and fine-boned, with dark eyes that seemed to hold more sorrow than any young woman should have to carry. Because she was young, couldn't have been more than 25, but she moved like someone much older, like someone who'd learned the hard way that the world wasn't kind to women alone. She stood on the platform looking around with an expression that Jacob recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror every morning, an expression that said she was looking for someone who wasn't there. Jacob knew he should leave, knew he should mind his own business and head back to his empty room, but something in that woman's face held him fast. He watched as she approached the station master, watched as she spoke to him with quiet urgency, watched as the old man shook his head and gestured vaguely toward the street. Even from where he stood, Jacob could see the moment hope died in her eyes, could see her shoulders sag just a fraction before she straightened them again with visible effort. As she picked up her carpet bag and started walking toward the street, and Jacob found himself moving before his brain caught up with his feet. He didn't know what he intended to say, didn't have any plan beyond not wanting to see another lost soul wandering alone on Christmas Eve. He caught up with her just as she reached the edge of the platform. "Miss," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. She turned, and up close he could see that her eyes were green, the color of bottle glass, and there were shadows under them that spoke of sleepless nights and hard traveling. "Miss, I don't mean to intrude, but you look like maybe you're in need of some assistance." She studied him for a long moment, and Jacob could see her weighing him, trying to decide if he was a threat or just another stranger in a world full of them. Finally she spoke, and her voice was soft but steady. "I was supposed to meet someone here. A man named William Garrett. He placed an advertisement for a wife and I answered it, and we've been corresponding for 3 months. He said he'd be here to meet my train." Jacob's heart sank. He knew Bill Garrett, Knew him for a no-account gambler who spent more time in the Lucky Dollar saloon than he did at the freight office where he supposedly worked. He'd heard Garrett bragging just last week about some scheme involving a mail-order bride, laughing about how he'd get her passage money and then disappear before she ever arrived. Jacob had thought it was just drunk talk, the kind of ugly boasting men did when they'd had too much whiskey. Now, looking at this woman's face, he realized it had been true, and Bill Garrett had already spent her money and vanished into whatever hole he'd crawled out of. "I'm real sorry, miss," Jacob said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "But I know Bill Garrett, and I'm afraid he's not the sort of man who keeps his word. Did you pay him money for the ticket?" The way her face changed told him everything he needed to know. The last bit of color drained from her cheeks, and her hand tightened on the handle of her carpetbag until her knuckles went white. "Everything," she whispered. "I sent him everything I had. He said the ticket was expensive because of the holiday, and that I'd need warm clothes for the journey and—" Her voice trailed off, and Jacob could see her fighting tears, fighting to maintain some shred of dignity in front of a stranger. The wind picked up again, colder now that the sun had fully set, and Jacob made a decision he couldn't explain, couldn't justify with logic or reason. He just knew that he couldn't walk away from this woman, couldn't leave her standing alone on Christmas Eve with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. A room above the saddle shop, the boarding house on Maple Street, had a sign in the window that said, "No vacancy," but Jacob knew Mrs. Henderson, who ran the place, and he knew she had a soft heart under all that starch and practicality. He led the woman, who'd finally told him her name was Elizabeth Connor, up the steps and knocked on the door with more confidence than he felt. When Mrs. Henderson answered, her expression shifted from suspicion to concern as she took in Elizabeth's exhausted face. "Jacob Mercer, what have you gotten yourself into?" Mrs. Henderson asked, but she was already stepping aside to let them in, already moving toward the kitchen where she kept a pot of coffee going all hours. Within 20 minutes, Elizabeth was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of hot coffee wrapped in her trembling hands, and Jacob was explaining the situation while Mrs. Henderson's face grew darker with each detail. "That Bill Garrett is lower than a snake's belly," Mrs. Henderson declared when Jacob finished. "I heard he skipped town 3 days ago, owing money to half the merchants on Main Street. Lord knows where he's gotten himself to." She turned to Elizabeth with genuine sympathy. "Honey, I wish I had a room for you, but I'm full up with railroad workers until after New Year's. Every boarding house in town is the same, what with the holiday and the crews working the northern extension." Jacob felt something twist in his chest as he watched Elizabeth absorb this news. She set down her coffee cup with careful precision, as if she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "I understand," she said quietly. "Perhaps there's a church that might—" "You can have my room," Jacob heard himself say, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. Both women turned to stare at him, and he rushed on before he could lose his nerve. "I've got a room above the saddle shop on Grant Street. It's not much, just a bed and a stove and a table, but it's warm and it's paid through the end of January. You can stay there tonight and tomorrow we'll figure something else out." "I couldn't possibly," Elizabeth started, but Mrs. Henderson cut her off. "It's Christmas Eve, girl, and you've got no money and nowhere else to go. Jacob's offering you a kindness and you'd be a fool not to take it." She fixed Jacob with a stern look. "And where will you be sleeping, Jacob Mercer?" "There's a cot in the mill office," Jacob said. "I've slept there before when I've worked late. It'll do me fine for a night or two." It wasn't entirely true. The cot in the mill office was a miserable thing, and the office itself was cold enough to freeze whiskey, but Jacob found he didn't care. The thought of Elizabeth trying to sleep in some church pew or, God forbid, back at the train station, was worse than any discomfort he might suffer. Mrs. Henderson seemed to read the determination in his face because she nodded slowly. "All right then," she said. "But Elizabeth, you come see me tomorrow after you've had some rest. We'll figure out what's to be done." She disappeared into her pantry and came back with a bundle wrapped in cloth. "There's bread and cheese and some cold chicken. You both look like you could use a decent meal." The walk to the saddle shop was quiet, the streets nearly empty as families gathered in their homes for Christmas Eve suppers. Jacob carried Elizabeth's carpetbag, and she walked beside him with her arms wrapped around the bundle of food Mrs. Henderson had given them. The snow had started falling again, soft flakes that caught in her dark hair and melted on her cheeks. Jacob found himself sneaking glances at her, wondering what her story was, what had driven her to answer an advertisement from a stranger and travel halfway across the country on nothing but hope and desperation. His room was up a narrow staircase behind the saddle shop, and Jacob felt a flush of embarrassment as he unlocked the door and let Elizabeth inside. He'd never been ashamed of the place before, never cared that it was small and spare, but seeing it through her eyes made him acutely aware of how little he'd made of his life. There was a narrow iron bed against one wall, a pot-bellied stove that he kept going all winter, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a shelf that held his few books and the framed photograph of Sarah that he still couldn't bear to put away. Elizabeth stepped inside and set the bundle of food on the table, then turned to look at him with those bottle-green eyes. "You don't even know me," she said softly. "Why are you doing this?" Jacob thought about that question, thought about all the easy answers he could give, the ones about Christian charity and basic human decency. But standing there in the lamplight with snow melting in her hair, he found himself telling her the truth. "Because 7 years ago my wife died and I've been half dead myself ever since. And tonight, standing on that platform watching everyone else have someone to meet them, someone to go home to, I realized I was tired of being alone. And then you stepped off that train looking just as lost as I felt, and I thought maybe we could be less alone together even if just for one night." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I left Boston 3 weeks ago," she said. "I was working in a shirt factory, living in a room with 5 other girls, sending money home to my mother and my younger sisters. Then my mother wrote and said she'd gotten married again, to a man who said there wasn't room for me anymore, that I needed to make my own way. So when I saw Mr. Garrett's advertisement, talking about Wyoming and fresh starts and building a life together, I thought maybe it was God giving me a sign. I thought maybe I could have something better than 14-hour days breathing lint and going to bed hungry more nights than not." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "I sold everything except what's in that bag. I paid for the ticket with money I'd been saving for 2 years. And all the way here, I kept telling myself that even if Mr. Garrett wasn't exactly what I hoped, even if the life wasn't perfect, it would still be better than what I was leaving behind." She met Jacob's eyes. "I was wrong about him, but I think maybe I was right about Wyoming." Jacob felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 7 years. He moved to the stove and began building up the fire, giving himself something to do with his hands. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said. "And tomorrow, after Christmas, we'll go see about finding you proper work and proper lodging. Mrs. Henderson knows everyone in town. She'll help." They ate Mrs. Henderson's food sitting at the small table, and Jacob found himself talking more than he had in years, telling Elizabeth about Laramie and the mill and the mountains that rose up to the west like a promise of something bigger than their small lives. She told him about Boston and the factory and her sisters who were 12 and 14 and who she missed with an ache that lived in her bones. They talked until the candle burned low, until the stove needed feeding again, until Jacob realized with a start that it was past midnight. "Merry Christmas," Elizabeth said softly, and Jacob felt his throat tighten. "Merry Christmas," he replied. He stood and gathered his coat. "I'll come by tomorrow morning to check on you. There's water in the pitcher and more wood by the stove. You just—" He stopped, not knowing how to finish. "Thank you, Jacob," Elizabeth said, and the way she said his name like it mattered, like he mattered, made something in him start to thaw. He nodded and let himself out into the cold Christmas night, but for the first time in 7 years, the cold didn't seem to reach quite so deep. The beginning of something true. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of day where the sky was so blue it hurt to look at and the snow sparkled like crushed diamonds. Jacob woke on the miserable cot in the mill office with his back aching and his feet half frozen, but his first thought wasn't about his own discomfort. His first thought was of Elizabeth, wondering if she'd slept well, if she'd kept the fire going, if she regretted accepting help from a strange man in a strange town. He stopped at the bakery on his way to the saddle shop, spending precious coins on fresh rolls and a small jar of honey. Mrs. Schmidt, who ran the bakery, raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions, just wrapped the rolls in paper and told him to have a blessed Christmas. The streets were quiet, most folks still inside with their families, and Jacob found himself walking faster as he got closer to his room, anxious in a way he couldn't name. When he knocked on the door, Elizabeth answered so quickly he wondered if she'd been waiting by the window. She tidied the room, he noticed, made the bed with military precision and swept the floor, and she'd done something with her hair, pinned it up so that her neck showed pale and vulnerable. She smiled when she saw the rolls, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to something that made Jacob's heart stumble in his chest. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," she admitted as she set out plates. "I thought maybe in the daylight you'd realize what a foolish thing you'd done, taking in a stranger." "I thought the same about you," Jacob said. "Thought maybe you'd be gone, found someone else to help or caught the next train east." He set the honey on the table. "But I'm glad you're still here." They ate breakfast together, and then Jacob insisted on taking Elizabeth to meet some of the folks he knew around town. First stop was the general store, where Martha and Tom Brightwell ran a business that had been in their family for 30 years. Martha took one look at Elizabeth and immediately launched into a story about how she'd come west herself 40 years ago as a mail-order bride, how Tom had been nothing like his letters, shorter and balder and considerably less poetic, but how they'd built a good life anyway through hard work and choosing to see the best in each other. "You've got honest eyes," Martha told Elizabeth, studying her with the frank appraisal of someone who'd sized up thousands of customers over the decades. "And you've got good posture, which tells me you're not afraid of work. I could use help in the store, especially with inventory. It's not fancy work, but it's steady and it pays fair." Elizabeth's eyes went wide. "Truly? You'd hire me just like that?" "I'm a good judge of character," Martha said. "And Jacob Mercer vouching for you means something in this town. He's not the sort to bring trouble to my door." She named a wage that made Elizabeth's hand flutter to her throat, and Jacob realized it was probably more than she'd made at the factory, even working those brutal 14-hour days. From there, they went to see Mrs. Henderson again, who'd been making inquiries of her own. "Molly Peterson, who runs the dress shop, has a room above her store," Mrs. Henderson reported. "Her last boarder moved out when she got married and Molly's been lonely. She says she'd be happy to rent to a respectable young woman, especially one who might help with alterations and such." "Do you sew, Elizabeth?" "I can sew anything," Elizabeth said with quiet pride. "I worked in a shirtwaist factory for 3 years. I can make buttonholes that'll last forever and seams that won't split no matter how hard you pull." By noon, Elizabeth had a job starting the day after Christmas and a room waiting for her as soon as she was ready to move in. Jacob should have felt relieved that she was settled, that his obligation was fulfilled, but instead he felt a peculiar sense of loss. He'd gotten used to her presence in the span of one evening and one morning, gotten used to the way she listened when he talked and asked questions about his work at the mill, and didn't seem to think he was boring or broken beyond repair. They were walking back toward the saddle shop, neither of them quite ready to say goodbye, when they passed the church. The doors were open, and inside Jacob could hear the choir practicing, their voices rising in harmony on some old hymn about joy and peace. Without discussing it, they both stopped, drawn by the music and the warmth spilling out into the cold afternoon. They stood in the back of the church listening until the song ended, and when the Reverend noticed them, he came over with his hand extended. "Jacob Mercer, I haven't seen you darken these doors since your Sarah passed. It's good to see you." His gaze shifted to Elizabeth. "And who might this be?" Jacob made the introductions, giving the abbreviated version of how they'd met. The Reverend listened with the kind of attention that made it clear he heard all the things Jacob wasn't saying, all the loneliness and loss that colored every word. When Jacob finished, the Reverend was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. "It's Christmas Day," he said. "A day for new beginnings and unexpected blessings. Seems to me that's exactly what the Lord has given both of you." He looked between them with knowing eyes. "Jacob, you've been walking through life like a man in a fog for 7 years now. And Elizabeth, you came here looking for one kind of future and found something else entirely. Maybe that's exactly how it was meant to be." They left the church and walked in silence for a while, both of them thinking about the Reverend's words. Finally, Jacob spoke, his voice hesitant. "Elizabeth, I know we just met. I know this is going to sound crazy, but..." He stopped, trying to find the right words. "I've been dead inside for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to wake up in the morning. And since last night, since you stepped off that train, I felt something I thought was gone forever. I felt hope." Elizabeth stopped walking and turned to face him. The afternoon sun caught in her dark hair, and her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I came here thinking I was going to marry a man I'd never met because it seemed like my only chance at something better. And instead I met you, and you've shown me more kindness in one day than I've known in years. You've asked for nothing in return. You've just been good to me because that's who you are." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold but her grip firm. "Jacob, I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll go to my room above the dress shop and we'll see each other sometimes on the street. Maybe we'll become friends who have coffee at the hotel on Sundays. Or maybe we could court," Jacob said, the words rushing out before he lost his courage. "Proper like, with me calling on you and us getting to know each other the right way. And maybe, if we find that we suit, we could build something real together. Something that starts with friendship and honesty instead of pretty letters and false promises." Elizabeth's smile started slow but grew until it lit up her whole face. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." They stood there on the street corner, hands clasped between them, while the Christmas afternoon turned golden around them. Jacob thought about Sarah, about the love they'd had that had been cut short too soon, and he knew she would have wanted this for him, would have wanted him to find his way back to living. He thought about the 7 years he'd spent as a ghost, and he thought about Elizabeth and the courage it had taken for her to travel halfway across the country on faith alone. "It won't be easy," Jacob said, wanting to be honest from the start. "I work long hours at the mill and I don't have much saved. I'm still paying off debts from when Sarah was sick. But I can promise you this, I'll never lie to you. I'll never make you promises I can't keep. And I'll do everything in my power to make sure you never regret getting off that train in Laramie, Wyoming." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "I came here with nothing, Jacob. I've got no expectations of mansions or easy living. I just want a chance at a real life with someone who sees me as a partner, not a servant or a burden. I want to work hard and build something that matters. And I want to do it with someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still find the strength to try again." They walked back to the saddle shop together, and Jacob helped Elizabeth gather her few belongings to move to Mrs. Peterson's place above the dress shop. As they walked through the Christmas quiet streets, Jacob found himself telling her about his dreams, the ones he'd buried when Sarah died, dreams of maybe owning a piece of land someday, of building a house with his own hands, of having a family to fill it with laughter and life. Elizabeth listened, and then she shared her own dreams, simpler ones about having enough to eat and not being afraid all the time, about maybe learning to read better and to write letters that didn't embarrass her with their poor spelling. "My mother married my father when she was 16, Elizabeth said. "She never learned to read more than a few words. When he died and she married again, she had to mark the marriage certificate with an X. I don't want that. I want to know things. I want to understand the world." "I could teach you," Jacob offered. "I've got books and my mother made sure I could read and cipher before she passed. We could have lessons if you wanted. Maybe on Sunday afternoons." By the time they reached Molly Peterson's dress shop, they had the beginnings of a plan. Jacob would call on Elizabeth twice a week, proper courting visits where they'd sit in Mrs. Peterson's parlor and talk about their days and their hopes. On Sundays they'd meet at the church and then go for walks, weather permitting, and Jacob would bring books and help Elizabeth with her reading. They'd take it slow, learning each other the way people should, building trust and friendship before anything else. Mrs. Peterson turned out to be a cheerful woman in her 50s who took one look at Elizabeth and declared her exactly the sort of sensible girl this town needs more of. She showed Elizabeth to a bright little room with a window that looked out over the mountains, and Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears at the sight of it. "It's the nicest room I've ever had," she whispered, and Jacob felt his heart crack open a little wider. As the sun set on Christmas Day, Jacob walked back to the saddle shop alone, but he wasn't lonely anymore. He climbed the stairs to his room and lit the lamp, and instead of seeing the emptiness that had haunted him for 7 years, he saw possibility. He saw a future where maybe this room wouldn't be his anymore, where maybe he'd have a house to build and a woman to build it with, where maybe the photograph of Sarah on the shelf could finally be just a sweet memory instead of a shrine to everything he'd lost. 3 months later, on a March afternoon when the snow was finally melting and the first green shoots were pushing up through the mud, Jacob and Elizabeth stood before the Reverend and spoke vows they'd written themselves. Martha Brightwell cried into her handkerchief, and Mrs. Henderson beamed from the front pew, and Tom Brightwell stood up as Jacob's witness with quiet pride. Elizabeth wore a simple dress she'd made herself, pale blue like a robin's egg, and Jacob wore his best suit that he'd brushed and pressed until every thread was perfect. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Jacob kissed his wife with a tenderness that came from knowing how precious second chances were, how miraculous it was that they'd both been standing on that platform on Christmas Eve, both lost and alone, both ready to be found. They walked out of the church into the spring sunshine, and Elizabeth tucked her hand into the crook of Jacob's arm, and they started walking toward the future they would build together, one honest day at a time. Years later, when people asked them how they met, Elizabeth would smile and say that Jacob had been the stranger who stepped off the train on Christmas Eve, and Jacob would correct her, saying no, she'd been the stranger, and they'd both laugh because the truth was they'd both been strangers, both been lost, and they'd found each other exactly when they needed to most. They'd built a good life from that unlikely beginning, a life filled with hard work and honest affection, with 3 children who grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, and with a love that had grown slowly and deeply, rooted in the solid ground of mutual respect and shared dreams. But on that Christmas Eve when it all began, standing on the platform in the freezing wind, neither of them could have imagined how a single act of kindness would change everything. Jacob couldn't have known that offering his room to a desperate stranger would lead to the fullest life he'd ever lived. Elizabeth couldn't have known that the worst betrayal she'd experienced would lead directly to the greatest blessing. They couldn't have known any of it. But they'd both shown up. They'd both been brave enough to hope, even when hope seemed foolish. And sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes showing up is enough. Sometimes, one kind act on the loneliest night of the year is the beginning of everything that matters.